4 years ago, standing in this very place, I proudly accepted your nomination for President of the United States. And with your help and with the votes of millions of Americans, we won a great victory in 1968. Tonight, I again proudly accept your nomination for President of the United States. And let us pledge ourselves to win an even greater victory this November in 1972.
Have you heard of Richard Milhous Nixon? Of course you have. But did you know he was not a trusting man? He was a paranoid man. And did you know he felt as though there was a shady elite out to ruin him in his 1972 bid for re-election? Nixon felt like he needed an easier candidate to beat in the election than anyone the Democrats would run. But how could he ensure this? By making sure he got a hand in picking that candidate. By making sure the frontrunners had accidents and scandals. Never mind, that was totally out with his presidential control though. Edmund Muskie was born in Rumford, Maine, to Polish-American parents. He had been a lawyer prior to the outbreak of American entry into World War II, where he had served as a naval reserve and worked his way up to lieutenant. During the 1954 midterms, he became the first Democratic governor of Maine in nearly 20 years. This was shocking for three reasons. Muskie's only political experience prior to this had been State House of Representatives. His back hadn't fully healed after being broken a year earlier, and senior party members had retired after Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower's 1952 landslide. However, from his victory, Muskie received a flash of national attention. This included a television appearance and a Life magazine spread. He was popularly elected to the US Senate only 4 years later in 1958. During the chaotic 1968 presidential election, Muskie was chosen to run as the Democrats' vice president. He was the running mate to incumbent Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Ironically, they were going up against Richard Nixon, who himself was the Vice President to Eisenhower and loser of the 1960 presidential election. The first polls had Republicans Nixon and his running mate Spiro Agnew leading with 43% to Democrats' 28%. This can be explained by a general resentment towards incumbent President Lyndon B. Johnson handling of the Vietnam War. This was the main reason for him not seeking the nomination, instead getting Humphrey to run. The 1968 election saw Republicans barely secure a win, with Nixon securing only 1% more of the popular vote than Hubert Humphrey. Muskie saw a great deal of speculation and national attention in 1970. First, he received 62% during his Senate re-election campaign. Secondly, he gave a very well-received bipartisan speech on the opening voting night for the midterms. The election eve speech had over 30 million listeners, and it critiqued politics of fear, mudslinging, and culture wars. Lastly, he was able to pass many amendments to the Clean Water Act, supported victims of the Jackson College stating, and announced his intention to run in 1972 if he was able to convince himself he was the most unifying candidate. 1970 did not endear everyone towards the idea of a Muskie presidency, however. Susan Sirhan of the New York Times wrote that it was best to think of Maine as a hick state that is justly celebrated for lobsters, potatoes, and summer holidays, but not producing presidential candidates. Nixon needed to win 1972. Obviously, he wanted to, but this was something deeper, something psychological. He had to win. He had to prove to everyone, especially himself, that 1968 had been no fluke. Nixon was not about to sanction another humiliating loss like in 1960. No, that could not happen again. He needed to win, even if that meant using less than legal means. So when the hotshot Muskie was polling equally to, and in some cases leading him, Nixon couldn't let that happen. He had to do something, and that something was creep. Officially, the Committee for the Re-election of the President was a fundraising campaign for a second Nixon term. Unofficially, however, they undertook political sabotage too. The Canuck letter was a defining cause for Muskie failing to get the 1972 nomination. Forged by Creep, the letters supposedly penned by Muskie called French Americans in Maine the racial slur Canucks. This demographic was a large part of his base and a large part of the New England electorate, so there was a furious backlash. Muskie spent time and credibility rejecting the letter. Conservative media mogul William Loeb III was never a supporter of Edmund Muskie. After Muskie visited Moscow in 1971, Loeb took great joy in lambasting him as Moscow Muskie in a front-page hit piece, and called him, I quote, a very dangerous man. The publisher of the Manchester Union Leader, a conservative newspaper based in Manchester, New Hampshire, Loeb printed a front-page editorial about Muskie. It was the Canuck letter. The letter claimed Muskie was laughing with staff at a drug rehabilitation centre, where he made the remark that he could deal with issues faced by African Americans, despite Maine having a small black population, because Maine has Canucks. Loeb also published a guest editorial from Newsweek, which picked out the most scandalous moments from a Women's Wear Daily reporter, Andrea Candy Stroud, following of Muskie's wife Jane on the campaign trail. They scandalously reported that Jane smoked, drank alcohol, and told dirty jokes. Muskie responded to the republished article by holding an open press conference in the open air during a heavy snowstorm. While Muskie maintained that he never cried, instead the snow had merely gone into his eyes, major newspapers in attendance claim he cried. This made him less palpable to the more emotionally restrained American public. Muskie was hardly the only contender for the 1972 Democratic nomination. He faced stiff competition from many prominent contenders, such as Hubert Humphrey, George Wallace, and George McGovern. Humphrey had appealed to old-school liberals while it was barely losing the last election. Wallace appealed to southern and midwestern working-class white people. Special shout-out, though, to Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to competitively fight for a major party nomination. Muskie also suffered from two main personal problems: the inability to connect with voters and a press-rumoured bad temper. Eventually, Muskie decided to drop out of the primaries. The final straw that broke the camel's back was the New Hampshire primaries, where George McGovern, initially seen as a dark horse candidate, was able to steal Muskie's thunder in both Iowa and New Hampshire. He went on to win the nomination, but lose the 1972 election in an electoral landslide. Muskie ended up finishing 4th overall in the primaries, with 11.34% of the popular vote behind him. But after all the debacles, Muskie was not down and out. He won re-election to the Senate in 1976, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Honor, and he was briefly Secretary of State for Carter. As Secretary of State, he held the first meeting with the Soviets after they invaded Afghanistan. He helped bring a new plan for peace in the Middle East with the Carter Doctrine policy and the release of the last American hostages in Iran. He served as part of the Tower Commission, which investigated Carter's successor, Ronald Reagan, for his role in the administration's Iran-Contra scandal. In 1989, he also chaired the Maine Commission on Legal Needs, and for 2 months held public hearings on the inability of the state's poorest citizens to access legal aid. The 1990 report that followed is still used today. So from presidential hopeful to Secretary of State, bringing plans for peace in the Middle East, and investigating wrongdoings, holding public hearings for its poorest citizens, Muskie did all right in the end. As for Richard Nixon, that's a whole other story.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
Don't forget to like and subscribe and comment too. If you have any more suggestions, please leave them in the comments below.